sense, he's absolutely right. I mean, this is our job. It's in the script. We know we've got to do it.
To the outside world, Demi Moore had rewritten the rules of Hollywood power, beauty, and romance. On red carpets, she and Ashton Kutcher were the industry's golden couple, effortless, radiant, and seemingly immune to the harsh scrutiny of a 15-year age gap. But behind that picture-perfect facade lay a devastating reality, an agonizing cycle of self-betrayal, suppressed intuition, and emotional unraveling. While millions envied her fairy tale, Demi was quietly disappearing, sacrificing her hard-won sobriety and identity just to keep a man happy. Now, at 62, she is finally confronting the relationship that shattered her soul, revealing a dark truth no camera ever captured. In the early 2000s, Hollywood had a brand new obsession, and it was not a blockbuster film or a scandalous celebrity divorce. It was a love story that seemed to defy every unwritten rule of the entertainment industry. Demi Moore, the highest-paid actress of her generation, the woman who had shattered box office records and glass ceilings with films like Ghost and G.I. Jane, had fallen head over heels for a 25-year-old actor named Ashton Kutcher. And the world simply could not look away. When the couple first went public in the summer of 2003, the reaction was immediate and electric. Paparazzi swarmed every restaurant, every Malibu beach, every red carpet where they appeared together. Demi was 40 at the time, a devoted mother of 3 daughters, and a veteran of 2 very public divorces from Bruce Willis and Freddie Moore. Ashton was young, effortlessly charming, and riding the massive wave of his breakout role on that 70s show. On paper, the pairing made absolutely no sense to anyone in the industry. In person, however, they radiated a magnetic, almost reckless chemistry that silenced every critic and doubter overnight. The media quickly dubbed them Demi-ton, and the nickname stuck like glue across every tabloid and entertainment blog. They were absolutely everywhere. Front rows at Paris Fashion Weeks, glossy magazine covers, late-night talk show couches where they would finish each other's sentences and dissolve into genuine, unscripted laughter. To millions of fans watching from their living rooms, this was the ultimate modern fairy tale. A powerful, gorgeous woman proving that age was nothing but a number. A young, adoring man who worshipped her in ways her previous husbands never seemed to. It felt like a glorious victory lap for every woman who had ever been told she was past her prime. But here is the uncomfortable truth about fairy tales that the cameras never capture. The most dazzling ones are almost always built on the shakiest, most fragile foundations imaginable. Behind the scenes, Demi was already fighting a brutal, invisible war inside her own mind. Despite her staggering professional success, despite the tens of millions in her bank account and the iconic roles that defined an entire era of American cinema, she carried a deep, corrosive fear of inadequacy that had haunted her since childhood. Growing up in grinding poverty, shuttling between trailers and motels with an alcoholic mother and a revolving door of absent father figures, Demi had learned from a painfully young age that love was always conditional. You had to earn it. You had to perform for it. You had to make yourself indispensable. And the moment you stopped being useful or desirable, the people closest to you would simply vanish without a second thought. So when Ashton burst into her life, showering her with relentless attention, affection, and a kind of youthful, intoxicating energy she had not felt in decades, Demi did not just fall in love. She latched on with a desperation she would later describe in her memoir as almost suffocating. She wanted to be the woman he deserved. She wanted to prove she could keep up with his fast-paced world, his younger friends, his spontaneous lifestyle, his late-night parties that stretched well into the early morning hours. And that burning desire, innocent as it may have sounded in the beginning, quietly shifted the entire power dynamic of their relationship from the very first week they were together. Ashton was the one setting the tempo. Ashton was the one introducing the unspoken rules of their union. And Demi, absolutely terrified of losing the most exciting and validating thing that had happened to her in years, began making small, seemingly harmless concessions to keep the peace. She laughed off jokes that secretly stung. She swallowed her deep discomfort when his behavior crossed lines she would never have tolerated from anyone else in her life. She told herself it was healthy compromise, that every real relationship required sacrifice and flexibility, and that her discomfort was simply a sign of her own insecurities rather than a warning she should have heeded. But the most dangerous concession of all had nothing to do with petty arguments or social boundaries. It was a quiet, deeply private decision that Demi made in the early months of their relationship, a single, subtle shift in her behavior that would slowly and methodically unravel everything she had spent nearly 2 decades painstakingly building. And the most terrifying part of the entire story? She did not even realize she was doing it until it was far, far too late to turn back. If you rewind to the earliest days of Demi and Ashton's marriage in 2005, you will find a woman who was actively, almost aggressively, trying to convince herself that she was living her best life. And on the surface, the evidence was overwhelming. The couple had tied the knot in an intimate, deeply private ceremony that excluded even Demi's closest friends. They were building a sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate in the hills above Los Angeles. Ashton was launching his wildly successful production company, Catalyst, and Demi was basking in the glow of being the most talked-about wife in Hollywood. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt electric. But inside the walls of their home, a slow, methodical erasure was already underway. Demi would later describe this period of her life as a time when she became a chameleon, constantly shape-shifting to match whatever version of herself she believed Ashton wanted in any given moment. When he wanted to stay up until 4 in the morning partying with his younger friends, she stayed up, even though her body was screaming for rest. When he wanted to surround himself with a constant rotation of attractive, flirtatious women at their home, she smiled through the discomfort and told herself that jealousy was a sign of weakness, that a truly confident woman would never feel threatened by other people in her space. She was performing a version of cool, effortless detachment that she had absolutely no natural connection to, and the exhaustion of that performance was slowly hollowing her out from the inside. The most shocking example of this self-erasure came when Demi and Ashton began experimenting with what they called an open arrangement within their marriage. Now, to be crystal clear, Demi has never used the phrase open marriage to describe this period, and the exact details of what transpired behind closed doors remain fiercely guarded. But in her deeply candid 2019 memoir, Inside Out, she revealed something that sent shockwaves through the entertainment world. She admitted that she had allowed a third person into their bedroom, not because she genuinely wanted the experience, but because she was terrified that saying no would make her seem boring, uptight, or old in Ashton's eyes. She wanted to prove that she could be just as adventurous and uninhibited as the women half her age who orbited her husband's social circle. And so she said yes to something her gut was screaming at her to refuse. The aftermath of that decision was devastating in ways that Demi could not have anticipated. Instead of bringing her and Ashton closer together, the experience left her feeling profoundly violated, disconnected from her own body, and drowning in a shame so intense that she could barely look at herself in the mirror for weeks afterward. She described lying awake at night, replaying the moment over and over in her mind, wondering how she had allowed herself to cross a boundary that she had sworn she would never, ever cross. And yet, rather than confronting Ashton about how deeply the experience had wounded her, she buried the pain. She rationalized it. She told herself that this was simply the cost of being in a modern, unconventional relationship with a younger man, and that her discomfort was a personal failing, not a red flag waving directly in her face. This pattern of self-silencing became the defining rhythm of their marriage. Every time Demi felt a flicker of doubt, every time her intuition whispered that something was deeply wrong, she smothered that voice with logic, with love, with the desperate hope that if she just tried harder, sacrificed more, and became even more accommodating, Ashton would finally see her as enough. She was pouring every ounce of her emotional energy into a bottomless well, and the well was never going to be full. But the most dangerous chapter of Demi's silent surrender was still waiting just around the corner, and it would not come from a bedroom or a party or a moment of social pressure. It would come from a loss so shattering, so profoundly intimate, that it would crack open every wound she had spent her entire adult life trying to seal shut, and push her toward a decision that would nearly cost her everything she had left. By 2011, Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher had been married for nearly 6 years, and despite all the cracks forming beneath the surface of their picture-perfect union, there was one dream that still held them together with an almost sacred intensity. They wanted a baby. For Demi, this was not a casual desire or a passing whim. It was a deeply personal, almost spiritual longing that connected to the most vulnerable parts of her identity. She had raised 3 incredible daughters with Bruce Willis, but the thought of creating new life with Ashton, of building a family that belonged entirely to the two of them, represented something she believed could finally heal the fractured parts of her past. It was the one thing that made all the compromises, all the swallowed pride, and all the silent suffering feel like it might actually be worth it. And then, in the 6th month of her pregnancy, everything collapsed. Demi suffered a devastating late-term miscarriage that she has described as the single most traumatic experience of her entire life. She lost a baby girl she had already named Chaplain Ray, and the grief that followed was so overwhelming, so all-consuming, that it effectively shattered whatever fragile emotional scaffolding she had been using to hold herself together. She could not eat. She could not sleep. She could barely speak without dissolving into uncontrollable tears. The nursery they had lovingly prepared sat empty and silent, a constant, suffocating reminder of the future that had been ripped away from her without warning or explanation. And in the middle of this unimaginable darkness, Demi needed her husband more than she had ever needed anyone in her entire life. But instead of finding the unwavering support she desperately craved, Demi found something far more dangerous. According to her own account, it was during this period of profound grief and emotional fragility that Ashton casually suggested that her long-standing commitment to sobriety might be a bit extreme. He reportedly implied that having a glass of wine or a cocktail here and there was perfectly normal, that her rigid avoidance of alcohol was rooted in fear rather than genuine necessity, and that a truly recovered person should be able to drink moderately without any real consequences. Now, it is critical to understand the gravity of what happened next. Demi had been sober for nearly 20 years. She had fought tooth and nail to escape the generational cycle of addiction that had destroyed her mother's life and nearly destroyed her own. Her sobriety was not a lifestyle choice. It was a lifeline. It was the single most important achievement of her adult existence. And yet, in her most fragile, grief-stricken state, Demi listened. She rationalized. She told herself that maybe Ashton was right, that she had been clinging to outdated rules that no longer applied to the strong, stable woman she had become. So she took a drink, and then another, and then another, and within a matter of weeks, the carefully constructed fortress of her sobriety had crumbled entirely, replaced by a desperate, escalating reliance on alcohol and prescription medications to numb the unbearable pain of losing her daughter. The spiral was rapid and terrifying. The woman who had once been the picture of Hollywood discipline and control was now disappearing into a haze of substances, emotional volatility, and increasingly erratic behavior that alarmed everyone around her. Her daughters noticed the change immediately. Her friends began making worried phone calls behind her back. And Demi herself, trapped in the fog of addiction and grief, could barely recognize the person staring back at her in the mirror. But as Demi was drowning in the consequences of her broken promise to herself, a far more sinister betrayal was already unfolding in the shadows of her marriage, one that would soon explode across every screen, every headline, and every social media feed on the planet, and leave Demi standing alone in the wreckage of everything she thought was real. By the autumn of 2011, the cracks in Demi Moore's marriage were no longer something she could quietly manage behind the closed doors of her Beverly Hills estate. For months, whisper networks across Hollywood and screaming tabloid covers had been relentlessly hinting at trouble in paradise. There were blind items about late-night hotel encounters, rumors of wild parties in Las Vegas, and constant murmurings that Ashton Kutcher was living a secret double life whenever he was away from home. Yet, Demi did what she had spent years training herself to do. She defended him with fierce, unconditional loyalty. She took to social media, posted defiant photos of them looking radiant and united, and publicly ridiculed anyone who dared to suggest their bond was anything less than unbreakable. But deep down, in the quietest, darkest corners of her mind, Demi knew the truth was closing in. The devastating tipping point arrived on September 24, 2011, a date that was supposed to be a sacred milestone for the couple. It was their 6th wedding anniversary. Instead of spending the evening together celebrating how far they had come, Demi was in New York promoting a short film project, while Ashton traveled to San Diego with a group of friends for a weekend of partying. Within 48 hours, the story exploded across the internet like a wildfire that nobody could contain. A 22-year-old administrative assistant named Sarah Leal went directly to the press with shocking, intimate details of an encounter with Ashton in a luxury penthouse hot tub at the Hard Rock Hotel. There were explicit text messages, eyewitness accounts, and a paper trail of indisputable evidence that instantly made the scandal the biggest entertainment story in the world. The betrayal was agonizing enough on a personal level, but the manner in which it unfolded turned the knife even deeper. This was not a private heartbreak discussed in quiet tears behind closed curtains. It was a global spectator sport. Supermarket tabloids splashed photos of Ashton and the other woman across their front covers, while late-night talk show hosts made cruel, dismissive jokes about Demi's age, her desperation, and the inevitable failure of a woman marrying a younger man. The media narrative was savage. Demi was framed not as a grieving, devastated wife, but as a foolish, aging star who should have seen this coming from miles away. The public humiliation was so profound, so suffocating, that Demi's nervous system simply shut down. When she finally confronted Ashton, the confrontation was not met with the kind of heartfelt contrition or desperate pleas for forgiveness that might have allowed them to heal. Instead, the emotional wall between them had become impenetrable. The illusion had shattered completely, leaving Demi standing in the wreckage of a marriage she had sacrificed her sobriety, her self-worth, and her sanity to preserve. In November of 2011, she released a brief, heartbreaking statement announcing her intention to end the marriage, writing that as a woman, a mother, and a wife, there were certain values and vows that she held sacred. Yet, filing for divorce did not bring closure or relief. If anything, it stripped away the last remaining structure that had been keeping Demi anchored to reality. Free from the marriage, but still hopelessly enslaved to the alcohol and prescription pills she had used to numb her pain, Demi retreated into a terrifying, self-imposed exile. She stopped eating. She barely answered phone calls from her oldest friends. And most painfully of all, she became emotionally unavailable to her 3 daughters, Rumor, Scout, and Tallulah, who watched in horror as their mother slipped further and further into a terrifying abyss of depression and substance abuse. The woman who had once been the ultimate symbol of Hollywood resilience and untouchable power was now living on borrowed time, completely isolated in her home, surrounded by pill bottles and ghosts of the life she had lost. And within just 2 short months of announcing her divorce, that dangerous spiral would lead directly to a single, chaotic night that would nearly cost Demi Moore her life. By January of 2012, Demi Moore was a ghost of her former self. The woman who had famously sculpted her physique into a cinematic powerhouse was now dangerously frail, reportedly weighing less than 100 pounds. Her cheekbones protruded sharply, her dark hair hung limp, and her large hazel eyes were sunken with profound exhaustion. The tabloids were having a field day printing gruesome photographs of her skeletal frame, but the reality inside her Los Angeles home was infinitely darker than any paparazzi snapshot could ever convey. Demi was spiraling out of control, mixing heavy doses of prescription pain medication, energy drinks, and alcohol just to survive each agonizing day. The breaking point arrived on the night of January 23rd, during what was supposed to be a small, casual gathering at her home. Among the guests was her eldest daughter, Rumor, who had been desperately trying to stay close to her mother while watching her slowly disintegrate in real time. As the night wore on, Demi, chasing any temporary escape from the suffocating depression that ruled her waking life, began inhaling nitrous oxide, commonly known as whippets, combined with a synthetic form of cannabis. What happened next was pure, unadulterated terror. Without warning, Demi's body went completely rigid. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed violently onto the floor, seized by a massive, uncontrolled convulsion. She was burning with an extreme fever, barely able to breathe, and entirely unresponsive to the frantic screams of the people around her. In an instant, the Hollywood superstar vanished, replaced by a dying woman fighting for air on the living room rug. A terrified friend grabbed a phone and dialed 911, setting off a chaotic, panicked emergency call that would later be leaked and broadcast to millions of listeners worldwide. On the recording, the raw panic in the caller's voice is chilling. You can hear people crying in the background, desperately trying to keep Demi conscious, pleading with the dispatcher to send an ambulance before it was too late. Within minutes, sirens were blaring through the quiet streets of her neighborhood. Paramedics rushed inside, stabilized her convulsing body, and loaded Demi into the back of an ambulance, speeding toward the nearest emergency room under the cover of night. When Demi opened her eyes in the hospital, she was hooked up to monitors, surrounded by clinical white walls, and stripped of every ounce of dignity she possessed. The story broke across global media outlets within hours. News anchors delivered solemn updates, entertainment blogs speculated wildly about drug overdoses, and the public watched with a mixture of morbid curiosity and shock. But the absolute worst consequence of that horrific night was not the international headlines. It was the devastating impact on her children. For Rumor, Scout, and Tallulah, watching their mother nearly die right in front of them was the final straw. They had endured months of emotional chaos, erratic mood swings, and the terrifying burden of having to parent their own mother. Following the hospitalization, all three daughters made the agonizing, protective decision to cut off contact with Demi entirely. For nearly 3 years, there were no phone calls, no holiday dinners, and no text messages. The silence was absolute, deafening, and completely heart-wrenching. Demi was now truly, completely alone. Her marriage was dead. Her career was frozen. Her health was shattered, and her own children could no longer bear to be in the same room with her. Lying in that hospital bed, looking at the bruised skin of her arms where IVs had been inserted, the harsh truth finally cut through the chemical haze. She realized that the substances had never been the root problem. They were just a desperate, clumsy anesthesia for a far deeper, more insidious sickness. She had spent her entire life trying to buy love by erasing who she was, believing that if she was not perfect, youthful, and endlessly compliant, she was worthless. Demi had reached the absolute bottom of the abyss. To survive, she would have to do something far harder than checking into rehab. She would have to strip away decades of trauma, dismantle her entire identity, and look at the broken pieces of herself with absolute, unsparing honesty. But did she have the strength left to face the demons she had been running from since childhood? When Demi Moore finally walked through the doors of Cirque Lodge, a secluded rehabilitation facility nestled in the snow-covered mountains of Sundance, Utah, she was not just entering detox. She was entering a total psychological reconstruction. In the past, whenever life became too heavy, Demi had relied on sheer willpower and intense physical discipline to power through the pain. But this time, willpower was completely useless. For the first time in 60 years, she had to sit in quiet rooms, stripped of glam squads, movie sets, and romantic partners, and look directly into the deep, unhealed wounds that had been driving her behavior since she was a little girl. In treatment, Demi began peeling back the layers of generational trauma that had haunted her lineage for decades. She revisited her childhood, the chaotic years spent pulling her mother back from intentional overdoses, the unbearable burden of having to be the adult in the household before she was even 10 years old, and the gut-wrenching betrayal of being sexually assaulted as a teenager. For decades, Demi had internalized a toxic, subconscious belief that her only value in this world came from taking care of others and looking flawless while doing it. That belief had fueled her legendary, punishing workout routines in the 1990s, where she pushed her body to the brink of collapse for roles like striptease and G.I. Jane. And that exact same belief had made her completely vulnerable to the intoxicating, destructive dynamic of her marriage to Ashton. She realized that her desperate need to be the cool, easygoing wife was never about love at all. It was about pure, unadulterated fear. Fear of abandonment. Fear of being discarded because she was no longer young enough, thrilling enough, or malleable enough. She had sacrificed her boundaries, her sobriety, and her dignity simply to avoid the agony of being left behind. And in the process, she had abandoned the most important person of all, herself. Leaving rehab was only the first step of an agonizingly slow, uphill climb. The real test lay back in Los Angeles, where the silence from her 3 daughters remained a crushing daily reality. Rebuilding trust with Rumor, Scout, and Tallulah could not be accomplished with an apology or a grand Hollywood gesture. Her daughters had been traumatized by years of watching their mother unravel, and they needed to see genuine, sustained change before they could let their guards down. So Demi did the hardest thing imaginable. She waited. She respected their boundaries. She worked her 12-step program with rigorous, uncompromising honesty. She went to therapy week after week, learning how to sit with uncomfortable emotions without reaching for a bottle or a pill. Slowly, month by month, the ice began to thaw. First came cautious text messages, then tentative coffee meetings, and eventually, tearful, transformative conversations where Demi took full, unreserved accountability for the pain she had caused her children. When her daughters finally welcomed her back into their lives, the family emerged stronger, more bonded, and more authentic than they had ever been before. In 2019, Demi took the monumental step of releasing her memoir, Inside Out. Instead of writing a polished, PR-friendly Hollywood retrospective, she laid bare every single humiliation, addiction, and mistake with breathtaking vulnerability. The book became an instant #1 New York Times bestseller, striking a massive chord with millions of readers who recognized their own struggles in her story. She found deep peace living a quieter, grounded life on her ranch in Idaho, surrounding herself with rescue dogs, close friends, and eventually supporting her ex-husband Bruce Willis and his wife Emma through Bruce's heartbreaking frontotemporal dementia diagnosis. Demi Moore had survived the fire. She had rebuilt her family, reclaimed her sobriety, and made peace with her past. By all accounts, she was ready to settle into a serene, comfortable chapter away from the brutal judgment of the entertainment industry. But the universe was not finished with her story just yet. Just as Demi was embracing this peaceful, quiet phase of her life, a radical, fiercely unconventional movie script landed in her hands. A dark, body horror satire called The Substance. It was a project that would demand she expose every insecurity, every aging anxiety, and every physical vulnerability she had spent decades trying to hide. And the decision to take on that terrifying role would set the stage for the greatest, most unexpected resurrection of her entire life. When French director Coralie Fargeat approached Demi Moore with the script for The Substance, Hollywood insiders were stunned that Demi would even consider it. The film was an unapologetic, grotesque body horror satire about an aging television star named Elizabeth Sparkle, who was ruthlessly fired on her 50th birthday for simply growing older. Desperate to reclaim her relevance, beauty, and career, Elizabeth injects a mysterious black market serum that temporarily births a younger, flawless version of herself, setting off a violent, parasitic war between youth and age. For Demi, reading that script was like staring directly into a funhouse mirror of her own life. It forced her to confront every insecurity, every humiliating headline, and every desperate impulse she had ever felt about fading relevance, shrinking self-worth, and the brutal, unforgiving gaze of an industry that treats women like disposable commodities. Taking the role meant doing something truly terrifying. Appearing on screen with prosthetic aging, engaging in intense, unvarnished physical vulnerability, and exposing the very parts of her body and soul that she had spent decades trying to control, sculpt, and protect from public scrutiny. Instead of running away, Demi leaned entirely into the terror. She delivered a fearless, tour-de-force performance that laid bare the agonizing emotional violence women inflict upon themselves in order to feel loved and accepted. When The Substance premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in May of 2024, the audience was left completely breathless. As the credits rolled, the entire auditorium erupted into a thunderous, 13-minute standing ovation. Critics immediately hailed it as the defining performance of her 40-year career, an artistic triumph born directly from the ashes of real-life survival. Standing on international stages at 62 years old, glowing with an authentic, unshakable confidence that no cosmetic procedure, fitness routine, or younger partner could ever provide, Demi Moore had completed the ultimate Hollywood resurrection. She was no longer defined by the sensational tabloid scandals of her past, the public heartbreak of her high-profile divorce, or the near-fatal night that brought her to her knees in front of her own children. And when asked today about the relationship that once completely dismantled her world, Demi's perspective is profoundly devoid of bitterness. She does not look back at her marriage to Ashton Kutcher with lingering anger or resentment, but with the quiet, devastating clarity of a woman who finally understands why she had to be brought to that exact breaking point. Because here is the final, unspoken truth Demi Moore had to travel through hell to uncover. That toxic relationship did not actually destroy her. It destroyed the false, terrified version of herself that believed she had to shrink, compromise, and beg for someone else's approval just to be worthy of existing. The collapse was not the end of her life. It was the brutal, necessary death of her lifelong codependency. For decades, Demi searched for validation in the gaze of romantic partners, in the thunderous applause of box office crowds, and in the impossible pursuit of physical perfection. But standing at 62, fully sovereign and at peace, she finally knows the hard-won secret that saved her life. The love, respect, and forgiveness you spend your entire life searching for from others is something only you can grant to yourself. And once you finally reclaim your own soul, there is nothing in this world that can ever break you again. Decades after the world watched Demi Moore fight for her life in the wake of her most public heartbreak, she has finally revealed the single, unspoken realization that made her walk away from self-destruction forever. A shocking insight about love, power, and survival that reframes everything we thought we knew about her fall and ultimate redemption.